behalf of the Latin America Caucus of Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice here in Ann Arbor, working throughout Washtenaw County and southeastern Michigan, we are very happy to welcome you all here tonight. You are here for the fourth in a series of 5 speakers on issues related to Latin American and immigration issues. Tonight, you will be hearing Todd Miller speaking on borders, homeland security, and bridges. Next month, the month of May 10th, 4 weeks from now, we'll be ending our series with the struggle for environmental, racial, and human rights in Honduras. And yours truly will be speaking on that. So we hope that you will continue to accompany us on this series, and that you will tune in on May 10th. And you can look for further activities and either educational or mobilizing opportunities through the ICPJ website that is icpj.org. So very welcome to look there for the Latin America stuff and other wonderful activist stuff going on in our area. I'd like to let everyone know that we have 2 co-sponsors tonight. The University of Michigan Latin America and Caribbean Studies, known as LACS, is one of our co-sponsors that has made this possible. And also the Huron Valley Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, have also generously supported us in bringing this series to you. So we thank them, and we thank you all for coming. Our format for tonight will be to introduce our speaker and then to have him talk, and he will share with us all that he has brought with him tonight and from his vast experience. And during his talk at any time, and you certainly can wait until afterwards also, please put any questions or provocative comments that you have in the chat. We hope that when Todd is done speaking, that we will have a robust discussion, and I'm sure that there will be many questions that will arise for you, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Jennifer will be collating and feeding those questions to Todd, and so at any time, you just feel free to put them in the chat.
Okay. Sent.
Is there anything else, Rebecca, that I'm missing before we move on? Okay, thank you. So I am ready to turn this over to Jennifer, who will introduce our speaker, to whom we're very grateful for being here tonight. Go ahead, Jen.
Thank you. I am not hiding. I just don't have a camera tonight. Thank you all for coming. When we were putting our speaker series together, or even before when we just started talking about it, I very much wanted to have Todd as our speakers, and I'm so thankful that he has obliged us. I first became aware of Todd's work when I attended the first border encuentro in Nogales, Arizona, just a ways south of Tucson, and found out about the hideous amount of security systems and more about the so-called security and really surveillance is what it is, surveillance that we have that has exploded. And So I learned some things that are frightening, but I needed to learn them. But Todd, he is an author of 4 books. His most recent, Build Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders. And Todd writes a weekly post for the Border Chronicle. He's researched and written about border issues for more than 15 years, and the last 8 as an independent journalist and writer. He lives in Tucson, but he has also spent many years living and working in Oaxaca, Mexico. And so also you can find there are other places you can find his work, but NACLA, the NACLA report, is an excellent way to get some information on places that we don't necessarily see as much about. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Todd, for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate being here with all of you on and everyone who's organized, went into organizing this event. And it's really an honor to be here with you tonight, especially on what I hear is for those in Michigan is a nice warm evening coming out of the winter. And needless to say, in Tucson, it's warm and sunny as well. That's where I am in southern Arizona and in the desert. So, but anyhow, today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the theme. Looking at borders, homeland security, and bridges. And I thought a good way to do it would be to really talk about I have 4 books. My last book's called Build Bridges, Not Walls. And it came out now a year ago. I think it's almost exactly the year anniversary that this book came out. But this book, the 4th book, is really a kind of reflection in a lot of ways, or a meditation based on the previous 3 books, which were more straightforward investigative journalism, looking at the border, policing, and immigration enforcement apparatus. So for example, my first book, and I think I came to the University of Michigan as part of the book tour with Ian Robinson, who is here tonight. My first book was called Border Patrol Nation, and it came out in 2014, and it looked at the post 9/11 expansion of this border fortification and how it's expanded. My second book was called Storming the Wall, and it's almost looking at that sort of expansion of the border, but adding an element of climate change. So looking at climate displacement, and borders. And then my third book was called Empire of Borders. And in that book, it was very straightforward investigative journalism of following the money. And what I did was I traveled all over the world following US federal government money to different places, such as the Mexico-Guatemala border, such as the Guatemalan-Honduran border, such as the Dominican-Haiti border, such as the Jordanian-Syrian border, such as the Kenyan-Tanzania border, to see how the United States government is funding border programs in other countries. So I mentioned those 3 books because I'm going to touch on all of them tonight. And the 4th book is called Build Bridges, Not Walls, and it really encapsulates all of the kind of reporting and what I learned through all these years of doing this reporting and writing these books. So I thought that would be the best thing to share with you tonight. And so I'll just get started, and I'm going to do a lot of storytelling really for these 40 or so minutes that I'll talk at first before we have a nice discussion afterward. But I want to start with a story that happened a couple of years ago. And I was, and it's really how my 4th book was born. I want to show you the cover, not to promote the book necessarily. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just the cover of it. It shows a wall turning into a bird, right? And I just want to talk about how this book was born based on, you know, all that the reporting I just mentioned, but also there was an incident, and I was traveling, and I think this incident is very illustrative of what goes on the border, and really speaks to what is the border and what's happening on the border. And so I was traveling down a dirt road, and for people here who are familiar with Southern Arizona, I was on the Tohono Nation, which is a Native American reservation that's it's a pretty large reservation, about the size of the state of Connecticut. So I was driving down a dirt road down on the Tohono Nation, and mind you, like all of Southern Arizona is pretty much Tohono territory, and into northern Mexico as well. So I'm driving down this road, and while I was driving down this road, all of a sudden a man appears on the side of the road, and he's waving his arms in distress. So I stopped the car, and I rolled down the window, and I asked if there's anything I can do for him, and can I give you a bottle of water? And so I give him a bottle of water, and it turns out that he's been walking through the desert for 2 to 3 days. His name is Juan Carlos, I would find out later, and he's from Guatemala. I should say, I want to mention one thing before I talk any further. Right before that, I was with an Tohono elder named David Garcia, and we were up in the Babaquiviri mountain range. For those familiar, the Babaquiviri mountain range is this beautiful mountain range that goes through southern Arizona and crosses the border into Mexico. So we were climbing up to the peak, and there was this moment. I want to mention this because there's a moment as I was with David and we were climbing up the peak. We're on the switchbacks, going back and forth, and I remember looking back, and in this view through the saguaro and ocotillo, like the different vegetation, and I looked into the horizon, into like the really expansive sky that is over Arizona and northern Mexico. And I remember stopping and pausing and thinking, I'm probably looking into Mexico, because I was seeing other mountain ranges deep in the horizon. And I thought, well, this in that moment, well, I'm seeing, there was a fleeting moment, and I want to say fleeting because this would go away, where I felt, this is what it was like to see a world without borders, because I didn't see the border at all. I was looking into Mexico, and in that there's a sort of you touch a sort of global consciousness, right? A moment like, again, unfortunately fleeting, but a place where, as I reflect on it and think back to that moment, I want to be there. And especially being with David from the Tohono Nation, where as I was looking deep into the horizon, what was called Mexico was also Tohono. It's been Tohono territory for thousands of years. So there was that moment, and then it was 2 hours later where I was on the road, and I was giving Juan Carlos a bottle of water, and he drank the water, and then I asked him, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" And his answer was, "Can you give me a ride to the next town?" And so that's the moment where whatever that I had, the fleeting moment on the Babaquiviri Peak, the border came crashing down, right? Because I hesitated in that moment. I hesitated primarily because I knew that if I gave him a ride and I got pulled over by Border Patrol, that I could face potentially years in prison, right? I could be charged with a felony. And so I hesitated, and the hesitation, of course, having done this reporting all these years, I knew it was around me. Like, I knew that there were most likely green striped Border Patrol vehicles around in the area. I knew that there were surveillance towers that had high powered cameras that could see maybe 7 or 8 miles away, and they had ground sweeping radar. I knew that there were all kinds of other surveillance gadgets, unattended motion sensors underground, perhaps Predator B drones flying overhead. The border is literally, the borderlands are literally filled with such surveillance technology. In fact, as an aside, I want to mention that I just went this 2 weeks ago to what is called the Border Security Expo in San Antonio. And when I was at the Border Security Expo, well, first I should say the Border Security Expo has been going on for 15 years, and it brings in all kinds of high officials from the Department of Homeland Security, from Customs and Border Protection, from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, from the border sheriffs. They all come in, and in this particular one, there were over 200 private companies that came in and displayed their technologies in a gigantic convention center hall. So when you go in the convention center, it's almost like going into a science fiction crystal ball in a lot of ways. I don't know if people saw that Department of Homeland Security 2 months ago announced that they had tested robotic dogs, these dogs that could be like automated border patrol agents. Well, those dogs were at the expo on display, crawling on the carpeted floor, as one example. And those dogs can be weaponized. There were other drone systems. There were camera systems. There were camera systems that were attached with drones that were along with camera systems. There are a whole biometric industry. The kind of digitized border is becoming more and more a big deal. So by biometrics, of course, I mean not only like digital fingerprinting, but facial recognition technology, iris recognition, those sorts of things. And this one that I went to in San Antonio just now, it was attended by 10,000 people came to it, and it was the largest one yet in 15 years. So that was saying something. And just to give you an idea of like how big private industry is and how much what I would call an industrial complex is a part of our border apparatus. In the last, or between 2008 and 2020, there were 105,000 contracts issued by Customs and Border, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and ICE to private companies to the tune of about $55 billion. So these sorts of contracts, this sort of what they call public-private partnerships in the kind of officialese language, is very much a significant part of what we're seeing, not only on the border, of course, it's ICE, so the kind of interior enforcement that we see throughout the United States as well. And so, you know, when I was in the desert there with Juan Carlos, I had been to several border security expos. This latest one was my 5th one that I've been to. So, like, you know, just imagining, you know, everything that's out there and knowing everything that's out there. And at the same, as so that was part of the hesitation, but the other part of then there was a second part to the hesitation, and that second part was a feeling of ire or anger. And that anger came directly from, I guess I would say, like, even values that I'd learned as a little kid about how to treat fellow human beings, right? Like if somebody's in distress, you help them out. And it was obvious that he was in distress, obviously, because he was drinking water and he wanted a ride. He'd been walking through the desert for a couple days. So that basic thing that, you know, of helping somebody else out. And then here I was, you know, thinking about a law that said that I couldn't, or I might face prison time. And then the other thing about it is that when you know border strategy, and border strategy has been it's been under what is called prevention through deterrence. That's been the strategy on the US-Mexico border since 1994. And the prevention through deterrence strategy is purposely designed to fortify what are traditional crossing places, such as cities that are along the border where people traditionally would cross, blockade them with walls, reinforce that with technology and agents, and then force people or to circumvent those areas to cross and put them in the desert. And so precisely because of that strategy was why I was meeting Juan Carlos there in that moment. That strategy, as activists or humanitarian aid people say often in Southern Arizona, is that they call it death by design, because one of the things that people confront when they cross the border, that what's determined is that if you blockade the traditional crossing places, then a person would have to walk days through the desert, and they couldn't carry enough water, they couldn't carry enough food, and they're going to face all kinds of problems, hardships, including death. And there's been 8,000 remains at least, 8,000 remains that have been found in the US-Mexico borderlands since this policy since the 1990s with this policy. And the humanitarian aid organization No More Deaths calculates that there's probably 3 to 10 times more that if people who have died. So that's why it's called a humanitarian crisis. So here I was, and knowing all this stuff and having to hesitate with Juan Carlos, and really that's where this reflection that came with the final book, Build Bridges Not Walls, but also, like, I don't want to just say it's the book, it's really my way of thinking about the border, that really came from doing that book, but also just the way that I'm going as I think about the border. So so looking at that, like as there's like encompasses a meditation, a compass is like this kind of moment where with Juan Carlos, and I'll return to that moment, before I end talking today. And then what I did with this particular book was I took that question of the border, and this is the bridges part, right? I took the question of what the border is, what is this thing, and I brought it to as many different people as I possibly could, from people like Juan Carlos who are crossing the border, to people like throughout Latin America, for example, to humanitarian aid activists or border activists, to Border Patrol agents. And I'm going to share a story from a Border Patrol agent in a minute here, to like philosophers and visionaries. And I just wanted to hear a wide array of different thoughts and thinking about the border and children. And one of the children that I want to, there's one story from from my own child actually, that I think really encapsulates what I think of when I think of building bridges not walls, right? The bridges part of it. And I was at Imperial Beach, and for people not familiar with that, that's the beach just south of San Diego. It's the beach where the border wall goes about 30 yards into the ocean, and you could see the waves crashing through the bollards. The bollards are the bars on the wall, so you can see the waves crashing through the bollards and crashing onto the beach. And I was there with my family, including my 4-year-old. And as we approached the border wall, we could see like people on the other side, and my 4-year-old waved and people waved back. So he started to run towards the border wall to say hi. So I was going with him. And as he was running, all of a sudden this Border Patrol agent who we hadn't seen, who was kind of perched on top of a hill, hit his horn, and it was kind of a metallic sounding horn. It was like, and you could hear this. He had an intercom, and so his voice came out going, "Do not move any further. Do not go any further." And my 4-year-old looked up at the sky because couldn't see the Border Patrol agent, like it was coming from the sky itself. It almost sounded like it, but like a 4-year-old, right? He looked and then he didn't see anything. He paid no attention, kept running. And so the Border Patrol agent hit his horn even louder and said it again. So long story short, William's my 4-year-old, now 6-year-old's name. He sat down on the sand, and then I went and sat next to him, and just kind of, we sat there and talked for a minute. Just I told him about what I do, really, what about the Border Patrol agent, who he was, what about the wall, and then he said one of the most insightful things to me, and it's one of the things, like probably the lenses that I carry with me about the border now. He had just learned the word excavator, which I probably mispronounced. Like for some reason I can't pronounce that word, excavator. But he said, why can't we take an excavator and crush the wall? He used the word crush, and then turn the wall into bikes. So basically crush the wall, use that word, the material of the wall, right? And instead of using that as a wall, use that metal and turn it into something much more beneficial to his perspective, which would be bikes. And that was pretty much, it was after he said that, I really like started thinking about, the border, wrote this book, but also started thinking about the border from really that perspective. So one of the things with bridge building, when you're thinking about bridges, is like you have to go into the realm of the border and talking about maybe removing this enforcement apparatus, removing like what, when you start questioning it, then you run into like the stigmatized territory of what, open border, if you say open borders in the world today, you might get a lot of flack from people depending on who you talk to. If you go to Washington on one side of the aisle, you might get ridiculed. On the other side of the aisle, you might be said, well, this is impractical. But one of the things that I want to bring forth tonight is to say like that some of the questions that need to be asked aren't being asked about the border, at least in the national discourse. And one way, one story I want to share is one with a Border Patrol agent who he's one of the people that I interviewed in this book. And he not only has, I'm going to tell a story, which is one of the most powerful stories of empathy I think I've ever seen, but also a story of how a Border Patrol agent comes to the conclusion that the border itself is quote unquote absurd, to use his own language. He's now a former Border Patrol agent, but he told me, I interviewed him, and he told me a story that he was patrolling near the town of Arivaca, and the town of Arivaca is about 10 miles north of the US-Mexico border. And he got a radio, he was radioed in by dispatch. Dispatch said that people had tripped a motion sensor. Now, again, when you think about the surveillance apparatus on the US-Mexico border, there's 12,000 at least implanted motion sensors that are underground, that if people step on them, it'll set off a beeping sound or in a command and control center. And that command and control center will say, hey, we think there's somebody. They might send a plane, they might send a helicopter, they might send a drone there, and to see what's going on. And then they will then radio to a roving patrol. And that's what he was doing. He was doing a roving patrol. Now this was 2008. So it was a few years ago. Brendan Lenihan was the name of the agent. He was hired in this massive hiring surge between 2006 and 2008 during the George W. Bush administration, when 6,000 new Border Patrol agents were hired. If you want to look, when you want to look to the time period where there was a massive expansion on the U.S. border, it was during those years post 9/11, those years of George W. Bush. Way more money put into it than Trump. during the Trump years later. And so, but that said, it started a process in which the budgets that went to border and immigration enforcement just kept going up and up and up and up and up. And I should go back to even if you go to the starting of the strategy of prevention through deterrence in 1994, it was a $1.5 billion budget for the Immigration and Naturalization Service. If you fast forward to 2022 to today, this year, and I'm talking annual budgets, $25 billion. So over those years, there's been the most dramatic increase of the border enforcement apparatus that we have ever seen, ever. And that is translated in like the walls and the surveillance and the agents. And Brendan Lenihan, the agent that I was referring to, he was hired during this kind of, as this flurry of money that was being put into DHS, CBP, and particularly CBP and the Border Patrol. So anyhow, Lenihan goes up this steep road. He comes up to an empty mine shaft at the top of this road, about 10 miles to the north of the US-Mexico border. And he sees footprints. When he looks down and sees the footprints, he gets out of his vehicle and he thinks, well, I'm going to go follow these footprints, as he does, as was his job. And as he was doing this, a man appeared out of a ravine in front of him. He was waving his arms, much like Juan Carlos. And this is all according to Lenihan in the interview that he told me. And he told Lenihan that a family member, which turned out to be his younger brother, was in distress in the ravine. So what Lenihan told me was that he normally would have arrested, or he would have asked this man for his papers. But for some reason in that moment, he did not do that. He decided not to do that. He did put on his assault rifle and he followed the man down into the ravine. So at the bottom of the ravine, the younger brother of the man was in distress. There was a cousin. The cousin was holding the younger brother's head and rocking it back and forth, like he was almost like a baby, like you would a baby, right? What Lenihan described to me was that when the younger brother opened his eyes, he could only see the whites of his eyes. And then a black bile started to come down out of the corner of his mouth. So what Lenihan did was he radioed dispatch again, called for a helicopter. The helicopter couldn't get into the ravine. So they said they would land somewhere else and they had to get the younger brother out of the ravine. So long story short, Lenihan clasped arms with the older brother by the elbows. They were holding their arms by the elbows to form a bridge, really, or like a stretcher, a human stretcher, while the cousin held the younger brother's head. And they carried him up the kind of steep ravine up to the top where the helicopter was going to come. And while they were doing that, and it was September in Arizona, it's still pretty warm. The sun was beating down and he started to sweat. And as I sweat, their arms lost their grip. So as Lenihan described it, his hands started to slip, and then all of a sudden they were holding hands. So he started holding hands with the older brother. At that moment, he was holding hands with the older brother. The younger brother started to vomit, and so as he was holding hands, he said that moment became, as he put it, strangely intimate. And then all of a sudden, it even said, I'll quote him directly, he said, a person I normally would be arresting, I was holding hands with him. And then he said he lost sense of who he was. And when he lost sense of who he was, he looked down at the younger brother, and he thought that the younger brother was his own younger brother. He thought that for a long moment, as they were going up the hill, until his radio crackled and he came back to where he was as a Border Patrol agent. And so long story short, they get up to the top of the hill, and it turns out that the younger brother probably died as he was bringing him up the side of the ravine. That night, Lenahan ended up going to a bar, as he told me, with other Border Patrol agents. The other agents knew that they would try to cheer him up, according to the interview, but they would say that this is all part of the border game. So the border game, of course, is finding dead bodies or encountering people who are dead or having people dying in custody. It was all part of, again, the design that I had mentioned earlier. And then the next day, he got the day off, and his supervisor called him, and his supervisor said, "Don't worry, we found out they were drug mules, quote unquote." And drug mules, of course, is Border Patrol lingo for drug smugglers. And then when Lenahan told me that part of the story, he looked at me and he said, "What?" He looked at me as if I asked the question. He said, "What did I care?" And I just want to read one quote, or I'll just tell you the quote, I guess. He said, he told me in the interview, he said, "I don't even know what I would have done if I would have, grown up, if I would have been in there and grown up where they grew up on the other side of the border. Like what would have been my prospects?" And then to top it off, the next thing that happens was that his neighbors were smoking marijuana below him, and it kind of wafted up into his apartment. And that's when he told me that part of it. And he said, "Here I am, my neighbors are smoking the very thing I was trying to stop," which of course is legal now in Arizona, by the way. This is before it was legal in Arizona. And he said, then he just looked at me and said, the border is absurd, right? The whole border is absurd. Of course, he doesn't say that this is the reason why he quit, but he's now a former Border Patrol agent. And I wanted to bring up, because you can look at all the different reasons for the border, and that one of them is what Lenahan brought up, the kind of the absurdity of it. And you can look at it from a drug perspective, from all the different reasons why the border is justified. But I think one of the most important insights that he said in his story was the idea of the border itself, just by its very nature. Like his whole, what happens where you were born, how it determines what's going to go on in your life, and how he described, without quite saying it, but in my opinion, he described this, that the border itself, far from being this, as we hear, border security, like, oh, it's protecting Customs and Border Protection, hearing all that stuff, the border itself is in fact an impediment to justice. It's an impediment to as people think about justice in this world, the border itself is an impediment to that. And so the last part of what I want to say today is I want to go back to the Bill Bikes not walls comment insight by my child, my genius child. No. But what if like you took that insight and just applied it to, what if we took it and applied it to the budget of CBP and ICE? Like, as I said, it's $25 billion this year. It went up for $1.5 billion in 1994. If you follow it, it just gets bigger and bigger. Like at the beginning of the Clinton administration, 1.5 billion in the 90s. And then by the end of the Clinton administration, 4.2 billion. At the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, it was 4.2 billion. By the end of it, it was nearly $15 billion, maybe 14 or 13. By the beginning of the Obama administration, it was 13, 14, or $15 billion. By the end of it, it was $17 billion. By the beginning, no, sorry. I believe it was 20 billion. No, it's $15 billion at the beginning of the Obama administration, $20 billion at the end of the Obama administration. And then at the beginning of the Trump administration, it was $20 billion. By the end of it, it's $25 billion, right? This budget just keeps going up and up and up every year. Right now, we're going to go into appropriations. The Biden administration just asked for more. I think it's going to be the budget that they asked for 2023 is going to be like upwards of $26 billion. And so like, my point is if we, contemplate, look through the lens instead, instead of the wall, why can't we build build bikes? But why can't we look at the budgets and say the same thing and go, why can't this money, like be spent on something else, right? Like you look at like, I don't know, you could even go domestic, right? Like, oh, if you think of security, if you take the word security, what it means, and human security and human well-being, well, the border, as I just described, it certainly doesn't cause security, right? So what could that money, like, it wouldn't contaminated water that people are drinking in different communities be a place better spent, or affordable housing, like we're in an affordable housing crisis, right? Couldn't that money be better spent in affordable housing? Or climate crisis, the climate crisis, and the kind of I worked on a report right before the COP, or the United Nations Summit in Glasgow last year, looking at border enforcement and immigration enforcement budgets from the top historic emitters, including the United States, compared to the money they were giving to climate action. And you can guess, right? The answer is that the ratio was nearly 3-to-1 in favor of border and immigration enforcement. In the United States, it was about 13-to-1 in terms of climate action, or money that you could help people in this kind of displacement that we're seeing around the world due to effects of the environment and what's going on ecologically. And so there's that part of it. Like, can't we, I heard somebody use, there's a crisis of imagination when we're thinking about the border and immigration enforcement. And like, why can't we think of something else? There's so many other things to think. There's so many avenues. I'm just throwing out suggestions. I'm not even saying I have an answer to this. I'm just throwing out the different, kind of dismantle what the apparatus is. Look at it, look at the money spent, and you just think, well, can't we just at least ask that question, right? Because it's even stigmatized to ask such questions at times. But this is what I want to do, is ask that question. So there's that part of it, and there's one last part of it, and then I'll go into we'll go into discussion after this, because I wanted to return into that moment with Juan Carlos, and I can't really tell you what I did when he asked for a ride. I can say that what you think I did is probably what I did, but that's what I can say. I can't tell you what I did. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that, speaking of climate change, right? And speaking of all the different possibilities of, climate change, I wanted to bring up, because it is a massive, it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of a displacement crisis that we're seeing around the world, right? But I wanted to bring that into the perspective of Juan Carlos, because in the brief time I had with him, I was not able to ask him why he was here. I was not able to ask him, why he walked for 2 to 3 days through the desert. I was not able to ask him, why he left his home in Guatemala. What were the reasons why? What I was not able to find out, that it could have been like many farmers in different parts of Guatemala, that he was flooded out, or as the rains didn't come and his crops wilted, or it could be that he was facing violence, or fleeing persecution, or it could have been that he was dispossessed by like the economic model, or extractive industry that you're seeing everywhere, or it could have been multiple factors, right? And in this kind of, I want to stress this so much, because here was Juan Carlos asking me for a ride, for orientation. But if I wanted to think about a world of justice, it was me who needed orientation, and it was me who needed guidance. It was me who needed to ask him, what is it? not only him, like what he represents, like where is he from in Guatemala, for example, and what were people saying that they needed for a just life, a dignified life, right? What were social movements saying there? What are they saying there? Because that's the border issues, right? When you're talking about a border being built up, thousands of miles away, in the case of Juan Carlos, to, as they would say at the Border Security Expo, a solution. Well, so that's what how I wanted to leave this. So I think, the kind of, as the Latin America caucus, right? You're thinking about the sort of cross-border solidarity and thinking about that in terms of how we view the border. And actually, I think the roots of the solutions that we might find to what's going on the border are precisely in that cross-border international solidarity and those kind of peoples coming together when they're otherwise and subverting these divisions that are often placed in front of us. And I'll leave it at that. And we can have questions and discussion and pushback. You can push back. I'm fine with that too.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you very much. Can you hear the clapping from where you are?
Oh, no. All the way from
all the way from there.
Yeah, I can hear it. I can hear it. Thanks.
Appreciate so much the putting of yourself into it. I knew from hearing about you and reading articles that you had all the facts and figures related to border and border control, border security. But you obviously brought your heart probably into gaining all of those facts and figures, but also into sharing it with us tonight. And I really appreciated that, and I'm sure others do as well. It's time, folks, to please put any questions or comments that you have into the chat, and we'll let Todd take a moment and take a drink of water, and let's get back to him. Pushback or feedback or any kind of any kind of responses and questions.
There are no questions in the chat just yet, but I've actually been making some notes myself, and so many things that you threw out there with one thing that struck me, especially this displacement globally that we're seeing. And it once again strikes me how people running from Ukraine right now, how they're being talked about, treated, again, as opposed to the people that are fleeing from south of our border, and how they get talked about quite differently. Thank you for bringing that area up.
Yeah, thanks for that point. It's a very good one. And I read this article recently about the kind of response generally that I haven't looked into enough, but as far as Ukrainian refugees, and the person argued that in the written piece of that should be the model, for it to how to look at refugees. It could. Now, I don't know enough about it, but there's a spirit of welcoming that as you just correctly pointed out, you have massive displacements going on, before that, going on parallel to that, in which there's precisely the opposite, right? Or the conflict itself isn't even identified, right? Of people of why people are being displaced, much less, you know, the kind of United States responsibility. That's one of the things that always baffles me. You know, when you look at, for example, US policy in Latin America over decades, and going back to the Monroe Doctrine or even beyond, right? Or you look at you know, the what's going on, and you look at, you know, all from ecological to economic. There's all kinds of US influence in this displacement that's just completely ignored when you're talking about these issues. And I fully think that those issues need to be brought up a lot more, because when you understand, you know, when it's understood, you know, the bigger picture, and displacement's understood. Like, people just don't, oftentimes I see border journalism and you see like, oh, people just appear at our border, like they just appear there, like out of a vacuum, right? Like nothing happened, or there wasn't, you know, all kinds of things that led to that moment. And that wouldn't a person who came all that way be there? There is a huge story there of why and how that happened and all the different reasons for it. It just seems like, anyhow, I'm just riffing on your question a little bit, but it just seems like that displacement part of it needs to be examined a little more, and the kind of responsibility for it needs to be looked at with a little bit more in depth, with more in depthly.
Sorry about that. I thought I was on my reliable computer, but I've had a couple flips here. We actually, we do have a few more questions now, and sorry, folks, they may not go in order. But speaking on, and I thought I had that, hold on. What you were just saying, there was something that goes quite a bit with this. Considering a lot of the poverty, violence, et cetera, occurring in Latin American countries are a result of US foreign policy towards Latin America, how can we right our wrongdoings and help these countries?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question to pose, you know, and maybe a forum for the caucus, right? You know, it seems that from that particular question, there's many ways to think about it, right? And look at those issues and really like identify those issues. One there's an article by geographer Joseph Nevins. I think it's called Migration as Reparations or something like that. The title of the article by Nevins is something like Migration as Reparations or something like that. But in the article, he goes deeply into US foreign policy in Latin America, particularly focusing on Honduras. And his argument in the article is that a form of reparations for that would be to open our borders, right? To make mobility, and to stop impeding and enforcing and punishing mobility of people crossing borders who might very well be crossing directly or indirectly due to US policies. And that would be a form of reparation. So that's one way of looking at it. I think you know, that's such a question though is worthy of a speaking, and I think that would be a great question for a cross-border forum, right, where you bring in people from all kinds of, like, all sides of the border. I say all sides of the border because if I say both sides of the border, then you just like US and Mexico, and I really mean like multinational, right? and to have that discussion of what that would be. I think that would be very interesting to see what would come of that.
Oh, absolutely. Another question. I'm surprised Biden is asking for more money for Border Patrol. I thought he was going to be more flexible about letting immigrants in. Not true. I'm sorry, I said that more of a
Unfortunately,
statement
yeah.
rather than a question, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, unfortunately, it kind of seemed that way, especially, I mean, definitely Biden kind of campaigned on that, right? And there were executive orders that were, along those lines for sure. And the mantra around border and immigration for the Biden administration since the get-go has been the fair, humane, and orderly. Those are the three words that the administration has used. And just, like, not, I mean, really, I mean, there's been small changes, and I don't want to discount like a shift in rhetoric, is, even though in terms of tangibles, in terms of substance, it's not really happening, at least in terms of going from a much more overtly racist White House, right, to somebody who's talking about, fair and humane, and having another narrative. I don't want to discount that as important. However, at the same time, what is going on the border is status quo. I mean, in 2000, the budget proposed by the Biden administration for 2023 is going to be the largest ever for border and immigration enforcement. The kind of policies that the Trump administration, like, he talked about rescinding policies from the Trump administration, and there was they rescinded Remain in Mexico, which is basically it's not allowing people, making people wait in Mexico, asylum seekers wait in Mexico for their asylum hearing, or their hearing. And but that was reinstated by court order, but it was reinstated with even, bigger, more expansive powers. Title 42 has been a big policy from the Trump era, the pandemic policy, right, from the CDC. Title 42 is the rapid expulsions. So if somebody crosses the border, they're rapidly deported and if you're an asylum seeker, you don't get the due process, right? So you get thrown back into Mexico. And that's been in place throughout for all the way up until now. The Biden administration has announced that it's going to phase out Title 42 in May. So that if that happens, that will be a change. But the overall border apparatus of the prevention through deterrence strategy that I mentioned at the beginning, the kind of the fortification of the border, like the Biden and his campaign said, I'm not going to put another foot of border wall, which is untrue. They have been constructing more border wall. But instead, I'm going to invest it in technology. To me, that statement is really, I mean, that the technology is a part of what Border Patrol calls the border wall system. It's part of the same thing. We're talking about invasive surveillance technology, those surveillance towers and biometrics and databases, and like stuff that would have Orwell spinning in his grave, right? And that's, that's part of the same border wall system. And that's what we're seeing a lot of, is this focus on technology. Heard it a lot at the Border Security Expo, because that was pretty much all technology. And so what I think, honestly, when you think of the Biden administration, is the Biden administration is going to continue the status quo. This has been the status quo cross administrations now for decades, right? And they're going to continue that status quo regardless of the party, unless there's pressure. There has to be pressure. And I think the Biden administration would be more susceptible to pressure than the Trump administration is not going to be susceptible to pressure at all. But the Biden administration would be more susceptible to pressure. But the problem is that the big pressure that's needed isn't there, because it's assumed that everything's better on the border with Biden, right? When there's less media on it, or the media that the coverage of it is more from Fox News, like stoking a kind of crisis narrative and the sort of thing that you're seeing on television right now. Yeah. So anyhow, I was just again riffing, so I will shut my mouth and I'll hear the next question.
Well, I think you're actually already kind of heading on, or, you're already hitting these points that a few folks are asking as follow-ups. So that is great. And as such, as you're saying about pressure points, there's a thank you. And what are the most effective pressure points for changing U.S. immigration refugee policies? In addition to targeting politicians, do you see potential in the movement targeting business and perhaps the anti-immigrant agencies themselves? If so, which specific targets would make the most sense? Thinking of examples like boycotting of Arizona in response to the SB 1070 anti-immigration legislation.
Yeah, I think all the above. If targeting, like just targeting a business, I think would be incredible, because the sort of awareness that all these businesses are involved. And like at the Border Security Expo, I remember going up to Verizon, right? Like Verizon. So I went up to Verizon and they had this whole kind of mini command and control center thing set up. And so I went up to them and like, Verizon, why are you here? And they went into this whole thing. Well, we're like disasters, right? We'll go to like different, like a hurricane, where a hurricane's hitting, and set up like cell phone coverage and that sort of thing. And then I was like, but what are you doing at the Border Security Expo? So it turns out, after question, finally somebody revealed, oh, we're helping with, they quote unquote, they said unaccompanied ... people. In other words, they were helping the Border Patrol in their detention centers of unaccompanied, probably minors, in remote areas. So Verizon was playing a part in the incarceration apparatus of the border enforcement apparatus, let alone whatever else they were doing as a phone company, the ability to get into people's phones and all that stuff, which I don't think they're going to reveal to me. But that sort of thing, like Verizon, like everyone, like it's just such a normal, quote unquote, sounding company, and just like that. I'm just going off the top of my head. I'm not necessarily suggesting Verizon should be the target, but it's interesting, because what if you do, like Verizon's like so quote unquote normal, so many people have Verizon accounts on their phones, that to see like them as a part of this border apparatus suddenly creates like, oh, this is more expansive, it's bigger, there's more things, there's companies making money off of it. So I think that's a great target. I think all the agencies, like the kind of stuff you've seen in the movement, where you see people like here in Tucson, people have dropped like below, like lie down in front of Border Patrol vehicles when they're trying to arrest people, and done those sorts of, or blockaded the ICE facilities where the vans would come out, and those sorts of direct actions. I think a whole variety of things would work, from politicians to direct action to movement building. I really think my personal, I don't know if this would be the most effective, but to go back, I think that cross-border solidarity is so huge for me, for my thinking about this, since the border itself is it's treated as a domestic issue in the United States, but it's truly an international issue. It's truly an issue of foreign policy and those sorts of conversations, I think, and whatever sort of movement building and that might swell out of that. I'm not an organizer, so I really can't go into this too much, but those are just some initial thoughts.
Hitting on a lot of things, absolutely. Still kind of on that note, is there any draft legislation that you think could offer a solution, or perhaps begin to dismantle the border game?
Yeah, I don't think there is. I mean, there's a lot of talk about comprehensive immigration reform, and and perhaps that in there could be something one day. I say that with hesitantly, because knowing like the other packages that have made it any length, I'm sure I'm sure people are drawing that up somewhere, because the Biden administration has talked about that being a priority, or something that they would prioritize. But in the past, when you look at the comprehensive immigration reform packages, I remember going to the Border Security Expo in 2013 or 14, and hearing from the vendors, like that's when the different packages, I think it was 2013 or 2012. It's one of those years. It was right before that one that was drawn up by the so-called Gang of Eight, the bipartisan bill that passed Senate. And I remember talking to the vendors, and they were saying, we're wondering what's going to happen, but as soon as comprehensive immigration reform passes, we expect to get a lot of money is going to flow in, meaning that there was a lot of money in the comprehensive immigration reform bill that was going to these technologies and enforcement, including, if you look at the one that passed the Senate, $45 billion going to border enforcement. And if you look at it in terms of private companies, in the 1,000 pages of that comprehensive immigration reform bill, there's earmarked per company what they might get. Like Lockheed Martin might get 10 Sikorsky helicopters, or and that sort of thing. So that's why, as comprehensive immigration reform is a thing that's drawn up, or that's the thing that you hear a lot about, and it could be a place to take some steps forward for sure. I do hesitate, or it's been traditionally the way it is. It's like, okay, you're going to have to put a lot into the border. Like the border becomes a sacrifice zone in the comprehensive immigration reform for maybe a legalization, some sort of legalization program that would be a part of it too. And so that's those, so comprehensive immigration reform, you could look for it. I would encourage people to look between the lines and see exactly what it is. But perhaps something will come in the future along those lines as far as legislation is concerned. I do think for a good comprehensive immigration reform bill to come out, it has to have grassroots pressure from people. I really do think that will be key to any sort of really effective bill.
Excellent. Yes, there were two questions that had to do with how this border militarization profits the war corporation, the military industrial complex, and how it helps further that idea of the other in the eyes of the American public. If you have anything else to say essentially on how more money gets pumped into the defense budgets and military contracts with this border and security.
Yeah, I would say it's a branch of the military industrial complex. The military industrial complex is gigantic, right? It's hard to match, but this is definitely a branch. It's similar companies, like in the top companies that are border contractors, Lockheed Martin's in there, General Dynamics, Boeing Corporation. So the big military contractors are the big military companies, or defense companies are a big part of it. What they do is they'll take oftentimes equipment that they use in wars in U.S. wars, particularly like the Predator B drones that were weaponized, that are weaponized overseas in different places like Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. Was like in the 2010s were brought, or in the 2000s were then repurposed for a Homeland Security, given a Homeland Security application. And then now, the Predator Bs are doing surveillance operations, and the company General Atomics is getting these big contracts. So yeah, it's a bit much bigger and bigger part of it. There's whole huge forecasts that are out there that you can look up. You can look up Homeland Security market forecasts, and a lot of them that I'm seeing are predicting still a very high growth rate in the industry. One that I saw recently predicted the industry, the global industry, this is not just the US, the global industry to be nearly $1 billion by 2026 from about $600 billion now. So you see a world, not only the US, but a world of a growing border. I would call it a global border apparatus. That's just like as Europe, as I say, Fortress Europe fortifies and different countries. And I look a lot into US border externalization, how it pressures other countries to build up its borders. Where it's becoming more and more a walled world, right? And as that happens, the market for the Homeland Security really grows and grows. So I think it's definitely a part of this industrial complex. The way the budgets grow, like the budget, like there's so much lobbying that's done around appropriations. Like soon, the Homeland Security budget will go into appropriations, and we probably won't hear much about it, but behind closed doors, there will be all these companies will be doing lobbying, and there's lots of campaign contributions, and the campaign contributions are given to both sides of the aisle and that sort of thing. So that's really, and it really, really becomes influential in terms of like the growth of the border, how budgets, and then really the messaging too, because the more the kind of fear messages out there, the more the kind of justification is to grow it more, and then the more contracts there are.
One other group mentioned with their hands in the till, or really profiting off this, mass criminal. One of the questions: can you talk about the mass criminal prosecution of the migrants and the growth of private for-profit prisons to which they're being sent?
Yeah, there's definitely like a border to prison pipeline, I guess you could call it. That it's. I remember I interviewed. There's an operation called Operation Streamline, and this is it's part of the Border Patrol's what they call the consequence delivery system. It's really like the whole part of it's part of the deterrence apparatus meant to punish people who cross. So it's if you cross the border, you're going to get charged with either illegal entry, quote unquote, or illegal re-entry. And I remember talking like, so what happens is that when people get arrested in the desert, and now I should say, with Title 42, Operation Streamline has been kind of temporarily suspended over the years of the pandemic. But I say that saying, as they phase out Title 42 next month, watch for Operation Streamline, because I think they're going to reinstate this. And what happens with Operation Streamline is when people get arrested, say in the desert, say in the Arizona desert, they'll be transported to face a magistrate judge in the Tucson federal court in the Tucson sector, and en masse, right? So you'll have 75 people, and they'll come up in groups of 8 or groups of 6 and be sentenced en masse for crossing the border, literally just crossing the border. And they'll be sentenced from 30 to 180 days in prison. They usually like do a plea bargain of some sort. So you have people like kind of, and mind you, when they approach the judge, people shuffle up because they're chained around they're handcuffed, chained around their waist, and chained around their ankles. So they have to shuffle up to face a judge with like 8 different people, and they all just say guilty in Spanish, culpable, culpable, guilty, 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 to the sentence of the judge, and will face 30 to 180 days in prison. And turns out that very prison where people are sentenced every day during Operation Streamline is run by a private company in Florence, Arizona. I'm just giving you one example of this to show how, a private corporation, in this sense, that's called CoreCivic, which was Corrections Corporation of America, they changed their name a couple of years ago, is running this prison, and then will make something like $130 per person per day, or something like that. Don't have the exact figure, but make money off of each person going to their prison just for that. And then of course they run the immigration detention system too. So you have the people prosecuted for crossing the border, but also the people in immigration detention, which is ICE, right? So people facing deportation. So people that, if you are facing deportation and you're challenging your deportation, you're put in ICE detention and indefinitely, right? Sometimes for years and years, and sometimes for months if you get deported to your country. And all those days you're in prison, and I think it's about 50% are run by private companies who are making money off of you for each day that you're in the prison. So that's a huge part of this whole industrial complex.
Absolutely. Slightly switching gears. Let's see. Because they have transformed a civil offense into a criminal offense, they can say that more and more criminals are coming into the country. Great point. Great point. A little bit of a switching gears. Can we hear some discussion on how we could imagine having open borders on our southern border?
Sure. I could throw out a couple things. Yet again, I want to say that while I advocate for that, like any sort of removal of this apparatus, I'm not claiming to know the answers. I'm just like, I think it has to be a collective, a sort of collective effort and a kind of holistic conversation where what things might look like. But that said, I mean, when you think of open borders, let's just start there. It's like, how can we even imagine this? Okay, on one point, you have to imagine, well, there is an open border system. And that open border system is not for when we bring up open borders, you think of, people arriving at our borders, often people in dire straits, right? Not like the open border system that has been codified with free trade agreements, where capital or US corporate power, for example, can cross over borders and go wherever they please at 35,000 feet. Like a company can go, an extractive industry, for example, can go set up camp somewhere, poison water of people, of communities, and no border patrol will stop them crossing the border. No immigration and customs enforcement will round them up and put them in detention and deport them, right? This is reserved for the people who have been displaced. And so to consider that there is a whole system of open borders in that sense for a certain sector, and where another sector there is not, and the poorer you are, the less likely you have it, right? And so there's that. And then there's another thing I want to bring up too, is like, let's just think of the United States. If you think of the United States, we think of the borders around the whole country, but like I can cross from Arizona to New Mexico and there's not an enforcement apparatus there. I can cross, you can cross all these state borders is my point. And there's maybe, during the pandemic, there was a couple checkpoints here and there, but there's usually not any sort of enforcement apparatus. So what I'm trying to say is there's an example of it right here, like right in the United States, in the country, of being able to cross from bounded territories to bounded territories, which are the states, with no sort of regulation of who's crossing. Like, are you a criminal crossing? Like, what's all that stuff? And I want to further underscore that point by bringing up, do you remember at the beginning of the pandemic when the governor of Rhode Island said that they were going to they're going to station the Rhode Island police on their border and look for New York State residents? Remember, this is when New York City was getting really pummeled by the pandemic. So they were looking for New York State residents. People are fleeing the pandemic, and they were going to go after them. And they were going to send the National Guard and look for people's vacation homes in Rhode Island. And you should go back and look at Andrew Cuomo's reaction, the former governor Andrew Cuomo's reaction to that. It was like, are you kidding? You know, he literally blew his head off. His head blew off. And he talked about, he threatened to sue Rhode Island. And I bring up that point because it's just a showing of how unnatural, like if you are used to freely crossing a border and all of a sudden somebody says, well, we're going to enforce this border, and then it shows you how unnatural that whole thing, the impeding of movement is. So I suggest you all go look at Cuomo's response, but you can look at around the world, you know, from state to state. You can look province to province in Canada, or you can look the Schengen, you know, the area in Europe, for example. I know that shifted with post-pandemic. I guess you have to look at the post-COVID and pre-COVID worlds. But this whole idea, there's examples of freedom of movement and freedom of mobility that are out there. And there's also like the consideration of who has the freedom of mobility and who doesn't. And when you start looking at that, you're into issues of justice, discrimination, and you're into whole other realms that probably need to be examined.
Okay, wonderful. I called for a robust discussion, and I think we've had it. I'm sorry for anyone's questions or comments that didn't get aired tonight, but others could have at least seen them on the chat. But we really, really want to thank you, Todd. We're drawing to the end of our time together here, and you have given us so much to think about and to imagine and to look into and to watch out for, and we thank you mightily.